Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another exciting evening here. And I'm very pleased to say that we have Dr. Lewis Dartnell here with us. And welcome back to you, Lewis, because it was good of you to return, having done, or at least stepped in at the last moment for Chris Lintott. And this time, by popular request, you're here as yourself. So I'm very pleased to hear that you're able to come back and visit us. Just a quick background, which I think probably you've already heard, which is after a first degree in biological sciences at Queen's College, Oxford, you moved on to UCL, where you are now.
I've actually since moved from UCL to University of Leicester now.
Oh, you're up in Leicester,
yeah,
so you come all the way down to see us.
Right. I'm still living in London, but commuting up to Leicester each morning.
Okay, so that means you're no longer, therefore, working for the Physics and Life Sciences, or was it the... I forget which group.
So I was in the Centre for Planetary Sciences at UCL. Right. I'm now in the Space Research Centre.
At Leicester. Know it well. Yes, spent many a time doing Beagle 2 work in there. So I'll hand over to Lewis and let him take us through the whole of the evolution of aliens.
Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So my name is Lewis, and as we heard, I've recently moved to University of Leicester from UCL. So I've moved from the Centre for Planetary Science, or the CPS, to the Space Research Centre. It's all a whole lot of acronyms. And the research that I'm continuing, this is on a UK Space Agency fellowship that I'm currently funded on. And this is doing some research, some work on ExoMars, which is the ESA, the European Space Agency rover that will be launched to the Red Planet, hopefully in 2018, to look for signs of life. And the instrument I'm working on at Leicester is known as a Raman spectrometer. It's one of the life detection instruments that can pick up organic molecules on Mars if they're there, because we've not discovered them yet. And when I first came down, when I was still at UCL last year, I spoke to you and delivered a very broad talk, a very kind of broad overview, introduction to astrobiology as a whole. And we looked at some of the biological discoveries we've made in the last couple of years, the last 10 years or so, about extremophiles and some of the hardiest life forms on Earth. And we looked at some of the planets, moons, and our solar system that we think might be potential habitats for extraterrestrial life. So Titan and Mars and Enceladus and Europa. And then I looked at some of the extrasolar planets orbiting other suns, other stars in the night sky that we think might feasibly harbour life on them. So this talk pretty much is kind of astrobiology part 2. It picks up from the story that I delivered first, although none of it directly relates to what I said first time, so don't worry if you missed the first talk. Because what I want to talk about tonight is all about alien evolution, what you might expect an alien to actually look like. If we do discover a true twin of our homeworld, another Earth-like planet orbiting a sun-like star in the habitable zone, in the region where it's not too hot, not too cold, but just right, with liquid water and seas and oceans on it, and evolution has had 3 or 4 billion years of time to create organisms that then adapt to their environment, what might you realistically expect them to look like? And how might that be different from what we've come to expect and become familiarized with in sci-fi, in cinema and TV and sci-fi novels. What I wanted to do just first, this talk was actually created for Cheltenham Science Festival a year or 2 ago. And they were quite keen to hear about what humans might look like in the future. So not alien evolution, but kind of human evolution in an alien environment. And the idea is if we start spending long periods of time in a space environment, so launching from the surface of the Earth into low Earth orbits like the International Space Station here, or hopefully in the not too distant future, even further afield to established lunar bases, moon bases or colonies on Mars, or people possibly spending their entire lifetime in space and in the space environment and being exposed to cosmic radiation and microgravity. So what effects might that have on the human body, and how might the human body change in response to that? What might we start looking like? And so some of the hazards of space I've thrown up on this slide here, from microgravity, which it looks like a lot of fun, floating around in weightlessness in the space station, and I'm sure it is for a couple of days, once you get over the kind of initial space sickness of it. But it's actually ravishing your body, and it's doing you a whole lot of harm and damage being in that microgravity environment. Or actually, more to the point, your body is trying to do what it knows best. It's trying to adapt itself to the new environment which becomes a problem in itself. And so things like your muscles, and particularly the postural muscles, the muscles that kind of hold your posture upright in gravity, so the ones in the small of your back and the lumbar region of your spine, and the kind of big, thick muscles in the front of your legs, they start deteriorating and degrading and kind of melting away because you're obviously not using them anymore because you're not having to stand up against gravity. Your heart, which is a great big kind of fist-sized lump of muscle, is also not having to constantly pump blood back uphill from your ankles back up towards your abdomen. So your heart starts deteriorating, or at least kind of getting weaker because it's having a less arduous job when you're in space. Your skeleton starts remodeling itself, and again, this is something that is a good thing when it happens on Earth, because your skeleton reinforces itself in places where there's lots of force and lots of impact, and it preferentially weakens other places that aren't seeing much force. So your skeleton is constantly remodeling to its current environment, and when it tries to do so in space, when you then get back into a gravitational environment, perhaps when you arrive on the surface of Mars, you may not be strong enough to stand up, even in the reduced Martian gravity. And you also have problems of all that calcium that's leached back out of your skeleton, then starts kind of giving you kind of chemical imbalance problems. And all these are problems that NASA and other space agencies are trying to solve for long-term human spaceflight. Reproduction is up here because there's been a couple of animal studies, no human studies as yet, obviously, of what happens to mammalian reproduction in weightlessness. And actually, it seems to not happen. And we don't quite know what's going wrong or what part of the multi-step process is getting caught at. But somewhere between conception and birth of animals, something is not getting its cue from gravity. And so this in itself might be a problem for human colonization of space in weightlessness, not being able to reproduce. And the other thing I alluded to, which is much closer to my own direct line of research, which is the cosmic radiation, the cosmic rays in outer space. Because once you get beyond this lovely thick shield you can see behind the International Space Station, the Earth's atmosphere, and also the deflector shield that surrounds our planet, the Earth's magnetic field, which helps deflect away a lot of this charged particle radiation, the cosmic rays in space. You're basically naked to this stuff when you go beyond the protective cocoon of the Earth. And this can have some expected results, such as cancer, but also is likely to start giving you cataracts in your eyes and making your eyes go opaque. And we don't really know at all what the likely effects are going to be to your immune system and how it might start affecting your ability to shrug off diseases and infections, or your nervous system, because a lot of, and in fact the majority of the cells in our brain, the nerve cells, neurons, do not regenerate like most other cells in the body. So if they start getting damaged and hit by radiation and then dying, your brain cannot regenerate and repair itself. So how feasible is it for people to start getting space sickness or space madness, space insanity, simply because their brain has been irradiated for decades of time in outer space? So these are all the hazards of the space environment that we're just starting to come to understand and develop countermeasures against, ways of mitigating and protecting people against them. And the idea is, and this got picked up by the newspapers at the time, that a future human might start looking something a bit like this. And an artist friend of mine called Rosie Greaves kind of mocked this up from my description. And the idea is that you get a lot of fluid redistribution when you no longer have gravity tugging it down towards your legs. So astronauts, particularly if they're born in space, and then whilst their skull is still very kind of malleable and kind of plastic, that fluid redistribution will kind of inflate your head up a bit like a balloon. So you might expect future humans born in space to have disproportionately large heads compared to people like us born on Earth. You're likely to perhaps get a bit overweight because, again, you not have to constantly exercise against the force of gravity. And the final feature that I kind of drew in here is you'll notice the astronaut's not only bald, but also is kind of lacking kind of eyelashes and eyebrows. And the idea is that maybe astronauts in the future might decide to induce alopecia, to induce total baldness and the loss of all body hair. Because in evolutionary senses and the point of hair and adaptation to the environment that humanity evolved to, the hair on your head helps to keep off the heat of the sun from your brain and from your skull and insulate it against the cold of the night. Eyebrows stop sweat running off your forehead into your eyes, and eyelashes have a kind of blinking dust out of the way. But you don't really get any of that in the environment of a spaceship or a space station. You're in an environment of constant temperature, because you're technologically controlling it, and any of the dust is being constantly filtered out so you don't start inhaling it. So maybe you might find astronauts choosing to take a drug to induce alopecia and becoming completely bald. And so this got picked up by the newspapers at the time when I did this talk at Cheltenham Science Festival of people in the future would not look anything like the Star Trek or Star Wars heroes, but they'd be short, fat, bald and ugly, which I suppose is kind of what I was saying, but not with the same spin. But again, maybe if you're choosing to this isn't an evolutionary sense. The body hasn't evolved to lose all its hair. It's a decision that the astronaut has taken to better fit themselves to their new environment. And maybe they might start taking an even more radical decision and losing the legs, because they do nothing for you in space, and they're kind of a dead weight that trails around behind you. So maybe you might find people that would have an even more extreme reaction to having committed themselves to spending the rest of their life in space. And make life easy for themselves. But the bulk of this talk, and what I wanted to move on to, is what would an alien genuinely actually look like? Or more to the point, how certain can we be about particular features of an alien body plan? Going back to the basics of evolutionary biology and principles of adaptation that we've come to understand looking at terrestrial evolution, what features of these are universal? What's turned up time and time again in our own terrestrial evolution, and therefore what can we assume might occur on other planets? Because at the end of the day, evolution is just trying to it's just trying to solve an optimization problem. It's trying to optimize your survival and that of your children, your progeny, against that of competitors, and tune yourself or adapt yourself to the environment. So you expect similar solutions to come up time and time again. Or on the other hand, what might be quirks and freak eventualities, if you like, of our own evolution? And we'll look at a human body plan to talk through some of those ideas. But I think we can say with a certain degree of definiteness that an alien would certainly not look anything like this. And these are the sci-fi conceptions of novels and films and TV series, and I'm certain you can name every single one of them, from Mr. Spock to Chewbacca. This is one of the wraiths from the TV series Stargate Atlantis. And these are the grey aliens. This is a still taken from X-Files. But this is a very common perception of what aliens look like, and some enormous fraction of the American population thinks they've been abducted by something that looks a lot like that. But the resounding point here is these aliens just don't look alien enough. This is some guy with bits of plasticine stuck to his ears or dressed up in a gorilla suit. And these concepts, these aliens, are more for the ease of the costume department or the makeup department, rather than based on any sound biological or evolutionary principles about what you might expect an extraterrestrial to really look like. And the reason this isn't just a frivolous bout of speculation, the reason this is important, or elements of what I'm going to talk about are very important and are being considered very seriously by research scientists around the world, is because of telescopes like this one here. This is the Kepler Space Telescope. And it's been launched already, and it's been in operation for a year or two. And Kepler is peering back along the spiral arm of our galaxy. This is where we are. That's where the Sun and Earth are, the solar system, in this artist's impression of the map of the Milky Way galaxy that we live in. And the yellow triangle here is where Kepler is peering through space. And so from our point of view, from the Earth's point of view, this is what the galaxy looks like. That's the swathe of stars of the Milky Way. That's our spiral arm seen from the inside. And the array of squares here are the CCD detectors, so literally the iPhone cameras that have been arrayed like this in the Kepler telescope to monitor about 150,000 stars simultaneously. So we've deliberately pointed Kepler to point in the night sky where there's lots and lots of stars all packed closely together, and we're using a method known as transit, where we watch to see if any of those stars blink back at us as we monitor them, to detect new worlds orbiting other stars, other suns in our neck of the woods, in this region, the spiral arm of the galaxy. And Kepler's already discovered over 2,000 new planets orbiting other stars, and we're really holding out and hoping for a particular kind of planet, a second Earth. So something I've already hinted at, an Earth-sized planet, not a gas giant, not a super Earth, 3, 4, maybe 5 times more massive than the Earth, but something that has the same mass and the same size and the same gravity as the Earth, orbiting a sun-like star in this Goldilocks zone, this habitable zone. And we might expect this second Earth to have oceans and seas and rivers of liquid water and continental masses like this artist's impression here, and perhaps flushed green with the colour of vegetation. So let's think first about what alien plants might be like, alien vegetation. This is a poster from the Day of the Triffids, the John Wyndham book. And again, we can root this on sound biological theory about our understanding of evolution on planet Earth, and then extend that and apply that understanding to evolution on other planets. Because as I've already hinted, any organism has been adapted by the process of natural selection to be optimized in particular ways, or to find a particular compromise between competing things that it's trying to optimize. So in the sense of plants, there are several things you're trying to maximize or trying to optimize to enhance your survival and pass on your genes to the next generation. And as a plant, one of the most important things you need to be able to do is conserve water. You can't dry out because you will then die, obviously. So the kind of shape of simple primitive vegetation was all looking a lot like this when it first colonized the continental land masses a few 100 million years ago. And so this is a shape that minimizes your surface area so you don't lose so much water. Another consideration that you want to try and maximize is obviously as a plant, you're photosynthetic. You eat, you feed by collecting the energy of sunlight and then converting that into the molecules and carbohydrates that fuel yourself. So you want to maximize, you want to optimize the amount of light you can collect. And the shape that does that for you is a very broad monolayer canopy. So none of your leaves are shading each other, and you're nice and spread out and flat, like a solar panel, to gather and collect as much light as you can. But you also want to disperse your spores or your pollen or your seeds as far as possible. So that means being very tall and very straight so that you can release your spores at the top and have them carried as far as possible by the wind. And that basically gives you the opposite kind of design, because you want to be tall and not spread laterally, which is what you're trying to do for light collection. And whilst you're trying to do all of those things, all of those three things, you've also got to maintain mechanical stability. It doesn't matter how much light you're collecting or how far you can throw your spores if you fall over the first time the wind starts picking up. So you've got to bear in mind, you've got to satisfy mechanical stability as well. And good ways of doing that are by having your branches much lower and closer to the ground. So depending on what kind of environment you're adapting to, you're evolving to, and therefore what are the dominant considerations that you need to pay attention to, you need to solve. Different plants on different environments, different biomes on Earth, have taken different shapes. And this is all from a paper this is a mathematical model of different tree shapes that they've kind of adapted and evolved over virtual time inside the model in their computer. And so if you're growing up in a very arid environment, like in the desert, when water conservation is your primary concern, you'll end up looking very simple, like a cactus here. If you're trying to maximize light collection, you might be a bit wider. And if you're concerned about mechanical stability, perhaps a fern at high latitudes, when you need to remain strong even though you're carrying a heavy load of snow during winter, you'll have another different shape. And so again, you can apply these same principles to plants and trees on other planets, and depending what the environment would be like, you'll find different solutions will be found by evolution to maximize your survival. But that's what shape the trees in a forest might have. What about the colours of the leaves, the colour of vegetation? Would vegetation in forests be a lush, verdant green on other planets? Or might you expect them to have other colours? So why are our trees green in the first place, I suppose, is the fundamental question there. And to answer that, we'll come back to the kind of basic science of light spectra. So a spectrum here is a graph. We've plotted the wavelength of light along the x-axis on the bottom. So with increasing wavelength, so from short wavelength, violet and blue light, up to kind of long wavelength, orange and red on the right there. And then we've got the intensity or the brightness up the y-axis. So if I had a laser pointer with me, that would be a particular color, a particular wavelength, and it would be very, very bright because it's a laser pointer. So we might have a laser pointer, a red laser pointer like this, or a blue one which wasn't quite as bright and was at a different colour, different wavelength, would be plotted differently on this spectrum. If we look at the spectrum of sunlight, it's obviously a very broad smear of lots of different wavelengths. It's a black body emitter, so it's a very broad emission spectrum. And so the emission spectrum of our own sun, this is the colour of sunlight here, and this little portion in the middle is what our eyes are sensitive to, what we've adapted to be able to receive and detect. So the visible portion of sunlight is this bit in the middle. And actually our sun is brightest, it peaks in this intensity spectrum around the wavelength of green light. And so what you want to do as a plant is absorb as much of that spectrum as you can, because that's what you convert into energy, that's what you grow by, that's what you survive by. And the curious thing that you realize, that we notice when we compare the solar emission spectrum in black here with what our plants are actually absorbing. This is the absorption spectrum of chlorophyll, which is the pigment inside all of the leaves of trees around the planet, as well as things like seaweed or simpler organisms like cyanobacteria, which are single-celled microbes that grow by photosynthesis, and in fact are what have been taken in to more advanced plants at some point in our evolutionary history. It's a theory known as endosymbiosis. They got taken inside and in the evolution of plants. And the absorption spectrum of chlorophyll shows a peak in blue and a peak in red. And for some reason, plants reject. They don't absorb. They throw away the most common kind of light in sunlight. They reflect the green light, which is why we see leaves as green. So why might this be? Why might plants throw away the most populous kind, the most frequent kind of light that they're trying to grow by? And the idea, the theory, is if you absorb lots of blue light, blue photons have the most energy behind them, so you can do a whole lot of biochemistry by absorbing those photons. If you absorb red photons, they're lower energy, but there's loads and loads of them going around that you can absorb. And by absorbing red and blue, you then reflect the green in the middle, because you basically don't need to bother absorbing them. And a lot of photosynthesizers on Earth, if they're living perhaps deeper down in the water column, have adapted ways of trying to breach in that middle bit and absorb some of that green as well. But what we notice in this absorption spectrum is it drops off quite suddenly towards the red. There's a kind of a cliff in that absorption, which means as well as reflecting a lot of green, which our eyes can see, which is why we see a green lawn, they reflect a lot of the near-infrared light as well. So if you could put on a pair of glasses that allowed you to see into the near-infrared, if you could extend the human perception beyond what is normally visible, you wouldn't see trees and grass and lawn as kind of verdant and lush green like this. You'd see them bright in the near-infrared. We'd have to invent a new colour that described the portion of the spectrum that's just beyond red and into the near-infrared, that trees would appear much, much bright in. They're dominated by that colour and not by green. And this is the two side by side. And the idea behind this red cliff, it's known as, is that if you were a plant and were to be absorbing that near-infrared light, you would heat up far too quickly. You'd have enormous problems with trying to regulate your temperature, and you'd end up getting far too hot and kind of damaging your cells. So particularly advanced, complex photosynthesizers like trees like this, it seems as if their leaf structure is designed to have that red cliff and help reflect and reject a lot of that near-infrared light. And for similar arguments, we'd expect plants and trees growing by a similar sun, so a similar star type to our G2 type dwarf that our sun is, that plants growing by that sunlight would also exhibit this red cliff. And we'll come back to why that's important. But our sun, which I said is a G2, is just one particular kind of star of all the different kinds of stars out there in our galaxy. And the diagram, the plot that you can draw of all the different stellar types is known as the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, which you can see here. And you're plotting the surface temperature of the star, which equates to the colour of light it emits from the surface. So from red, with cool stars coming up to much hotter surface temperatures and therefore bluer stars. And then the y-axis we have the luminosity, the brightness that light is given off by. And when astronomers were first plotting this diagram, i.e. they were collecting, or they were calculating, working out how bright a star actually is, rather than just how bright it appears in our sky, because they're completely different distances, and working what the surface temperature must be, and then plotting the stars they could see on it, they realized there's this great big diagonal slash across the diagram. This is known as the main sequence, and this is where most of the stars fall onto. And older stars that are starting to run out of their nuclear fuel will kind of wander and migrate along this giant branch, or even along the supergiant branch. And then when they've completely run out of fuel and nuclear fusion has stopped entirely, they drop over to this region known as white dwarfs, where they're just hot and still emitting, but getting cooler over time. And our sun sits kind of halfway along this main sequence and has a surface temperature that means it's yellow. And so the question becomes, well, that's what our star is like, that's what our sun is like. But actually the stars down here, the M-class dwarfs, the red dwarfs, or the K dwarfs, are far more populous in the galaxy. There's about 10 times more M-class dwarfs down here than there are of our kind of star. Our star is something of a freak in the galaxy. It's by no means the most common kind. Or on the other hand, if we don't have stars with planets orbiting that are cooler and redder and dimmer than our sun, but stars which are hotter and brighter and bluer, what effect might that have on the biology of planets orbiting suns like that? So again, if we go back to the spectra, this black line is the rough approximate spectrum, emission spectrum of our sun. Is the chlorophyll absorption spectrum still. A M-class or K-dwarf red star would have a spectrum a bit more like this. So the whole spectrum has been shifted towards the red end because it's got a cooler surface temperature and they're not as bright, so the spectrum is lower down. And the blue star would be the opposite, so it's shifted to shorter wavelengths and is hotter and more intense. And so, following the same argument, that the reason that our plants are green is because they use chlorophyll that absorbs the portion of the spectrum where our star is brightest, we'd expect plants growing on planets in the habitable zone orbiting different kinds of stars to basically have retuned themselves. They would shift the absorption spectrum, the pigment they use, or they choose a pigment that happened to have an absorption spectrum where they needed it. And plants growing in the sunlight of a red dwarf would have shifted their absorption spectrum over here, and plants growing by the blue light of a hotter star would have shifted their absorption spectrum over to the left. And that will clearly then have an effect on what colour they would appear to our eyes when we come to look at them. So the kind of plants growing firstly beneath a blue hotter star, and again this is an artist's impression obviously, might look something like this. And the problem they might face is that thank you, I've now got a laser pointer. And the problem these plants might face is that they would need to reject a lot of the light that falls on them, so they again don't overheat. They'd be facing the same kind of problem as plants in savanna beneath the midday sun on Earth. So you might expect them to actually be white, if not even silvery and reflective, to reflect away a lot of that light and heat, because they've got more than enough that they need. On the other hand, plants growing beneath the cooler, redder light of a red dwarf might try and grab and hold on to as many of the photons as they can. So they would fill in that absorption spectrum with other pigments to absorb as much of it as possible, and therefore might end up looking black to eyes because they're absorbing all of the colours. And so we'd expect to find this enormous diversity, not just in the shape of plants that we can predict from basic physics and the principles of good engineering design and constraints that plants would be operating under. So not just the shape of plants, but also the colour of their leaves, which you can follow back the chain of argument we've been talking about. The colour of the leaves will be dictated by the spectrum of the sunlight that they're trying to grow beneath, from black plants beneath a red dwarf star, or if you're on a planet that orbits a younger red dwarf star, these stars seem to be a bit more active and flary. And every time a flare goes off, you get a great big pulse of ultraviolet light, which would be a big survival challenge. That would be a bad thing for you to be exposed to. So you might find that life is then hindered and can't colonize the land masses, the continents, so it stays aquatic, with these kind of living rocks at the bottom, which are called stromatolites, which are built up by things like cyanobacteria, layer by layer. So they build up these kind of mushroom-shaped forms, and these are some of the earliest forms of life in the ancient rocks on Earth, or kind of free-floating through the water column, moving through our kind of solar spectrum, a G2 yellow star, these hotter, bluer stars. But all we've talked about so far is extending what we find on Earth to other planets. So can we go one better than that? And think about how alien evolution might come up with solutions or come up with different solutions to the same survival problems that plants on Earth have solved. And one of your major considerations, as we've already mentioned, is trying to grow upwards so you can collect as much light as possible and shadow your neighbours, your competitors, to grab the light and not let them have it, but also be nice and tall so you can disperse your spores. And trees on Earth do this by having basically a column design. You make your trunk nice and rigid, nice and strong, to support yourself against gravity upwards. But maybe you could have a different solution to the same problem. Rather than trying to be strong and growing up, maybe you could simply float up. And the idea behind these balloon plants isn't all that crazy at all. And all they would need to do, and you'll notice these are also green, so perhaps they're pigmented with chlorophyll as well. And the action of sunlight and chlorophyll in the photosystems of plants on Earth is to take the energy of the light that falls upon them and channel that into splitting water molecules apart to release the hydrogen that they need to then build up more and more complex organic molecules to grow by. And the oxygen is basically a waste gas. It's a pollutant for them. And the earliest photosynthesizers on Earth basically released that oxygen out into the atmosphere and committed a heinous crime of global pollution to change our environment forever, which our kind of life has now come to rely upon with this oxygen-rich atmosphere. But what you could do as a balloon plant is, rather than using all of that hydrogen to build up your molecules, you could allow it to escape as a gas and fill up a kind of membrane or an envelope, and therefore float up through an atmosphere as a hydrogen balloon. And in that sense, all you would need is a thin vine-like tether, which is very, very energetically cheap to make compared to a thick, strong trunk that would just hold you to the ground as you float up. And then perhaps when the time comes to reproduce, you could snap off that tether, float up through the clouds, and then kind of disperse your pollen or your spores beneath you. At least that's the idea. And again, this isn't so far removed. This isn't so crazy from what we do find on Earth. Not in the air column, but in the water column. And a lot of kelp or seaweed forests are held up by bladders of gas, either carbon dioxide or oxygen, that they've produced and filled dedicated kind of air bubbles in their leaf structure to hold them up. So it's kind of an adaptation of the same idea. And if we move on from alien plants to alien animals, this is the alien, the xenomorph from the films. And actually an intelligent alien, a spacefaring alien, if they exist, may already have quite a good idea about what we look like, because we've gone out of our way to tell them. And I'm sure most people in the audience here are familiar with the gold plaques, the discs that were strapped to the outside of the Pioneer and Voyager space probes, which are now flying at very, very high speeds and kind of heading out and towards interstellar space, exiting our solar system. And some of the information that we decided to draw on these plaques to kind of communicate in pictorial form to any being that may discover these human artifacts long time into the future. These lines here is basically a map of where the Earth and the Sun are. And these are directions towards pulsars, which are kind of like natural lighthouses in the galaxy, with the timing of the pulsar encoded here, so you can identify which ones you mean, and then triangulate back to where the Sun is, and therefore where this machine was produced and launched from. And then once you found the Sun, this map at the bottom shows you that we came from the third rock out from the Sun, i.e. from Earth. So this is the birthplace of the Pioneer and Voyager probes. And we draw pictures of a man and a woman, kind of an Adam and Eve type style picture on this Voyager. Although if you look closely, curiously, that the man is anatomically correct, whereas the woman isn't. And the story goes that there was a very last minute kind of loss in confidence in the people that were designing this plaque, that they didn't want to basically send pornography into space. They got all very prurient about it, and for bizarre sexist reasons, realised that, or thought that a penis was better than a vagina when you're drawing line diagrams of the human body plan. And for scale, this is the space probe in the background. So they even get an idea of how tall we are from the scale of the picture. So let's zoom in on this human body plan that we've kind of announced out to the galaxy on the gold plaque there, and take a look into some of its features, some of the features of our own anatomy, and the evolutionary histories and kind of narratives behind these different features, and what we might expect to happen time and time again if the videotape of evolution on Earth were ever reset or rewound to the beginning and then allowed to play back out again. What might we expect to reoccur from evolution on Earth, and therefore what might we expect to see of animals evolving on other Earth-like planets? And the things that we expect to see time and time again, the universals of terrestrial evolution, are things like sense organs. As an animal, you clearly need to have some way of gathering information about the environment around you to allow you to make decisions and find where the food is and to avoid things that are trying to make you their food. So you need sense organs like eyes to collect light about the environment around you, or vibrations in sound, or pick up diffusible chemicals, which is basically what smell and then taste are both doing. They're both chemosense organs, chemosense facilities. And you also want to be able to process the information these sense organs are sending back into you. And a lot of more primitive life forms, primitive animals on Earth, something like a jellyfish, will kind of have a ring of neuronal tissue, of neural tissue. But once you start getting more complex, it makes much sense to have all of that processing tissue in one location where it can communicate within itself very, very rapidly, which is basically a brain. So you want your brain to be very close to your sense organs so you can minimize your reaction time. You want your brain and your sense organs to be on the front of your body so you can see where you're going rather than the back, because you don't care so much about where you've been. And it makes sense to protect this most valuable organ of your processing center, because if that gets damaged, then the rest of you is toast. And so now we're starting to derive from first principles the need for a kind of a skull of armor, of bone, to protect your brain and your sense organs at the front of your body, which is basically just your head. And the essence, the fundamental of the human body plan, which is the mammalian body plan, which is the vertebrate body plan, is basically as a tube, a digestive tube running straight through the middle of our body with an entrance and an exit. And this through-flow gut is a very, very efficient way of taking nutrition, taking food from your environment, passing it through your body and giving you the capacity, the time to break it down and digest it and absorb back out the nutrients that you need. And all we've really done in hundreds of millions of years of evolution since we were worms with an entrance and an exit to our gut is kind of adorn and accessorize our basic body plan by strapping on some limbs that allow us to locomote, allow us to move in whichever environment we're in, whether it's flippers as fish or wings of a bird or an insect, or walking limbs once we colonized the land masses. And clearly you need some kind of skeleton to act as a framework to support yourself up against this gravity and allow your muscles to act against. So all of these are universals of evolution. They've appeared multiple times in very different lineages of life forms on Earth. They've appeared independently, and therefore we'd expect them to appear if we were to rewind the videotape of life on Earth or appear on other Earth-like planets. Other things, however, other features of our body plan are known as the features of contingent evolution. There's no reason to expect for them to have happened that way. They're not optimal or the best design in any particular way. And contingent features of our own body plan include things like 5 fingers. And the only reason we've got 5 fingers in our hand, it's not because a 5-fingered hand is better at grabbing things than a 6-fingered hand or a 4-fingered hand. It's basically because the first fish that clambered out of the seas to colonize the land masses, which then gave rise to all the vertebrate and quadruped land animals, just so happened to have 5 bones in its fin. It could have been 6, it could have been 4. We could have walked around and given each other high 4s or counted in base 12 rather than base 10. It's about as random as it gets. There's no good reason to expect that. And similarly, in extending that same argument, the number of limbs we have, we are tetrapeds. We have 4 limbs. And again, this just so happens to be because the first fish to clamber out that we all descended from had 2 pairs of lobed fins and not 3 pairs. We could have been hexapods. We could have been walking around with 6 pairs of arms and legs. 3 pairs and then 6 arms and legs. If you start looking at some of these sense organs, we've got a camera lens eye, like all other mammals, all other vertebrates. But another very, very common, very, very successful design for the eye is the compound eye of insects, like this fly here. And actually our camera eye has evolved independently in another very utterly unrelated lineage of animals, which are the cephalopods, the squid and the octopus and the cuttlefish. And because they've independently evolved the eye from a very different beginning, they've actually found a very different solution to wiring up the eye. And in fact, in many senses, they've designed a superior design. Their eye is better than our eye. And what this all comes down to is a feature of our vision, which is the blind spot. And we have a layer of light-sensitive cells in the back of our eyeball called the retina, which is where the photons of light, the light waves, are picked up and then transferred into electrical signals, which are all gathered together in the optic nerve, which then has to leave the eyeball to come back into our brain. And the place where all of those nerve fibers are bundled together into the optic nerve and sent back is a place on the back of the eyeball where you can't have light-sensitive cells. So there's a hole in our retina where we cannot see, simply because all the electrical cabling is coming out the back. It's where the eyeball is plugged in, basically. However, what the cephalopods have done, through random mutations and adaptation and natural selection, is the back of their eyeball, back of their retina, is flipped round back to front. So you don't need to have a blind spot, and you can just send out your cabling directly without having to have a gap in the retina. So the cephalopod has no blind spot, and in that sense, it has a superior camera lens eye designed to even ours. And the reason we'd expect any complex animal life form, any intelligent alien animal, the kind of thing that might build a flying saucer and land it on the White House lawn and come meet us, we'd expect for very good reason for it to blink back at us with an uncannily similar eye, like the cephalopod eye or our own eye. Because if you try to use an alternative, like the compound eye, it has such a poor visual resolution, such poor acuity, you need to have a very, very large compound eye to give the same kind of resolution and therefore ability to sense things around you as the octopus eye, and you'd have to have an eye something like this size. So Rosie Greaves very kindly drew up my compound eye chav, which is what you would look like with compound eyes like an insect, like a fly, that had the same visual acuity as our vertebrate camera eye. And for this good reason, we therefore expect any aliens striding down from the ramp of their UFO to blink back at us with a pretty recognizable pair of eyes. And the other thing we talked about was the idea of another contingency, was the idea that we have 4 arms and legs rather than 6. And it's a random occurrence. It could have gone another way. We're not optimal in that sense. And so you might expect to have hexapod animals. And this is a painting put together by a guy called Gert van Dyck, who's Dutch. And if you find any of this stuff interesting, he's got a really good website that you can look up on Google, where he's run a lot of these kind of thought experiments about what aliens might be like from well-founded evolutionary theory. So this is a hexapod grazing animal, some kind of analog to our antelopes. And the idea is that if you've got 6 legs, you only really need 4 of them for locomotion, for walking around. And so it frees up the front pair for readapting into something else, into some other function. And so this hexapod antelope has readapted its front pair of limbs as weapons for defense. So it is less likely to get eaten by hexapod tigers or something that it might have on its world. And again, this isn't such a crazy idea at all, and it happens time and time again in terrestrial evolution, because this is basically the same as the decapods on Earth, so the crabs and the lobsters, which have adapted their front pair of limbs not for walking, but readapted to great big claws for defense and or attack. And this is what the hexapod tiger might look like on their world, where it's, again, using its hind 4 legs for locomotion and their front pair of legs as attack weapons. And the idea, the name for this that Gert van Dijk has given it is centaurism, because they look like horses with a kind of a human body. And again, humanity itself is a very good example of this process, because at one point in our evolutionary history, we walked around on four legs. We were kind of like shrew-like animals at the time of the dinosaurs. And down through that evolutionary history, we've now started walking upright and readapted our front limbs, not for walking, but for doing things with, for grasping objects in the natural environment and manipulating them, turning them to tools, and then developing technology. So this process of centaurism has been critical in our own evolution. If we look at marine organisms or aquatic organisms, again, just by the principles of engineering constraints and good design, in order to move through water as efficiently as possible, you want to be nice and streamlined and kind of hydrodynamically shaped like a bullet, like a torpedo. And every single one of these examples here is a very, very different animal lineage that's adapted from different starting points to the life aquatic, but hit upon astoundingly similar designs. This is convergent evolution. From fish, like the shark here, to a cephalopod, this is a squid. Mammals have done the crazy thing of starting in the seas, adapting out to land-based animals, deciding they didn't like it out here because it's a bit cold, and then going back into the ocean, and then re-losing their limbs and adapting back into fins. And the interesting evolutionary relic that they've left behind in their body plan that tells you there's a very, very clear difference between a shark and other fish, and whales and dolphins and porpoises and other mammalian marine life, is that the back of the whale, the flipper, is horizontal, whereas the back of the shark is vertical. And this comes down to the structure of the hips of the hind legs that they were trying to readapt back into swimming rather than kind of bounding over the ground. These are birds, these are penguins, which have given up flight and decided they want to go back into the water. And this is a reptilian swimmer. These are dinosaur swimmers, or at the time of the dinosaurs at least. And again, for similar reasons, we'd expect alien fish to look pretty much identical to our own, because they also will need to be streamlined and waste as little energy as possible moving through the watery environment around them. But maybe they swim in a novel way. Maybe they found a different solution to the problem of propulsion. And again, this is one of Gert van Dijk's ideas, that maybe they could use jet propulsion to move forward. It's not impossible, it seems fairly sensible. And there are examples of minimal jet propulsion in terrestrial animals, and things like squid will fill up the mantle, fill up the kind of bag around their body, and then with a ring of powerful muscles, quickly squish it back down again and squirt a short pulse of water out through their siphon that points backwards. They kind of squirt forward in short pulses. But what you might be able to do is have a sustained jet propulsion, where you might have a channel running straight down the kind of underside of your body that is constantly forcing out a jet, just like a jet plane, like the kind of turbojets we build as engineers, as human engineers. And the way this might work is through the process of peristalsis. So you have a rigid outer cylinder and then a muscular ringed inner tube. And by constricting these ring muscles in a sequence, you can grab hold of a kind of a blob of water and then thrust it backwards and out the back to push yourself forward. And this is how peristaltic jet propulsion might feasibly work in an alien animal. And again, this isn't all that crazy at all, because this is a process that we're all using right now, sat or stood here in this room, because every time you swallow, you'll have rings of muscles which are kind of forcing saliva or anything you've just chewed up in your mouth down into your stomach, and then peristaltic waves just like this are forcing that food down through your digestive system. So it's a readaptation of that same idea to propulsion. And again, we'd expect alien flyers to look uncannily familiar. And actually the kind of visual pun in this photo is these aren't birds at all. They're, as far as you can see at first glance, identical to birds. But these are mammal flyers, these are bats. And the point that this photo, this slide is making, is that bats have adapted the skies to fly in the same way that birds do, and they've had to find the same solution. You need to have muscular wings that act as aerofoils to generate lift, to hoist you off above the ground. And if you start with a hexapod body plan, which we've already argued might be feasible, perhaps you could have biplane birds that have a pair of legs for landing and then 2 spare pair of limbs for perhaps beating out of phase with each other for flying in this alien Earth skies. The last wacky design of an alien that I was going to rattle through are known as sky whales. And again, this is a fairly common trope, a fairly common theme in sci-fi. And the science behind it, again, is quite sound. And if we're talking about a super-Earth planet, so a planet which is more massive than the Earth, therefore has a stronger gravitational pull, it will pull down its atmosphere much more tightly around its surface. So though the gravitational field is increased, therefore you would weigh more, it'd be more difficult to lift yourself up with your greater weight. Because the atmosphere around you has got thicker more quickly, it actually is easier to generate lift with a set of wings. So the paradoxical result is that on a super-Earth planet with stronger gravity, it becomes easier to fly, not more difficult. And the idea is you could have some truly enormous flying things swooping through the clouds above your head. These are kind of elephant-sized flyers, elephant-sized birds, being able to hold themselves up on their wings in the thick, soupy atmosphere. And the reason I hinted at the beginning of the talk as to why this is important, a lot of this has clearly been slightly frivolous and kind of speculative and fun, and I use it as a good way in schools talks of touching base with stuff that kids will have seen in cinema and sci-fi TV series, and using it as a vehicle to talk about the principles of evolution, about convergence and adaptation and contingencies in evolution, like our 5 fingers on our hand. But this is all starting to get very, very relevant, because with telescopes like Kepler, we're discovering more and more Earth-like planets. And this one in particular, Gliese 581G, this is an artist's impression. But if this planet exists, and it's still very much open to debate, it's a roughly Earth mass planet in the habitable zone of its red dwarf star. And the next step after discovering planets orbiting other stars is to characterize them. After detection comes characterization. And with this you use even bigger sets of more expensive space telescopes in order to gather the light that's coming from the planet itself and exclude the much, much brighter starlight. And you can then do spectroscopy on the light coming from that planet and look for fingerprints of the chemistry of the planet's atmosphere. So we'd start at first for looking for things like water vapor or carbon dioxide or possibly even oxygen in the air of an alien planet. And we think that oxygen would be a good signature for life, for having pumped it out there with photosynthesis. But other tricks you can do is looking from the light that's not passed through the atmosphere to your telescope, but reflected off the ground, and therefore it bears an imprint, it's encoded the colour of the ground beneath it, and therefore potentially the colour of forests that might be covering the continents. And if you're looking at Earth, and people have been able to do this experiment from satellites or by looking at moonshine, which is the light that's reflected, that's come from the sun, reflects off the Earth, and then reflects back off the moon back towards us. And you can see in the spectrum of moonshine, so you're basically just using the moon as a mirror, very distinctive in the spectrum of moonshine is that red cliff of vegetation. You can see the signature of forests by looking at the moonshine coming back at us. And we'd be wanting to do a similar kind of measurement for these Earth-like planets we discover elsewhere. So the important question, where would you expect to find that red cliff of vegetation on forests orbiting a star with a different colour? Where would that red cliff lie? What might be the spectrum of vegetation we'd look for? Because once we've discovered these Earth-like planets and then we can observe them telescopically, it will still be centuries before we can actually go there and get a close-up look. So the more we can do remotely with our telescopes and spectroscopically, the best chance we've got of spotting signs of life on other planets, of being able to make astrobiology a science for real. We've got a subject matter to study. I've been talking about this kind of stuff to TV producers as well. And there's a show that came out in the States last month on the Discovery Channel, which is called Aliens: Definitive Guide. And they gave me the opportunity of designing a raft of different kind of alien species. It's an intelligent alien with camera-like lens eyes you can see there. And another documentary that's coming out in the UK on the 16th of May, this one on Channel 5, it's called Aliens: Are We Alone? And again, I've been able to design from the fundamentals and principles of evolutionary biology what different aliens might look like, including this alien fish here. So if you're in, or set your video and have a watch of these, if any of this has been of any interest to you at all. But thank you so much, guys, for listening. That was a bit of a kind of rattling tour through some of the ideas of evolution, how we might apply them to astrobiology, and what we might expect to find out there. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. That was excellent. I think we've certainly learned a lot from that. Now, I'm going to open for questions if you're prepared to answer a few.
Yeah,
I'm sure
absolutely.
there should be. Can we start off with any questions from the audience? There's one at the back. Let's get this one in. Grab hold of that.
Right. Hi. There was life on Earth as far back as 4 billion years ago. However, it's become advanced from trilobites upwards for the last 500 million years. Now, if that rate of evolution is typical, that gives us a ratio of 1 in 8 Earth-like worlds. Could there be anything to speed evolution up, that you might know about, or if that's possible? That's my question.
Yeah, so the rate of evolution is a very interesting question. And a lot of experiments have been done on that, how quickly you can adapt to change of environment or to new circumstances, to new selection pressures. And a lot of this work is done on simple organisms that have quick generation times, so you actually can feasibly study it in the lab. And things are done with kind of Drosophila or fruit flies or amoeba or kind of bacteria. But if we're talking about our petri dish being an entire planet, and what rate the biosphere as a whole might be able to evolve greater complexity, it's quite a tricky thing to try and answer, because the different steps in evolution are that you need to have a source of mutation. You need to generate variation in a population of replicators, or a population of organisms. You need to have competition between those organisms. Either there can't be enough food to go around, or enough space to live in, or enough mates for everyone. So you've got to have some kind of competition between individuals, which means there's differential death, that the fitter survive, the less fit don't. And then the next generation will, on average, be therefore better fitted, better suited to its environment. So in any one of those steps, you could think of ways that you could increase the relevant rate, and therefore increase the rate of evolution overall. So you might start speculating that perhaps if there is a greater mutation rate, there might be more raw material for evolution to work with. So maybe if you are orbiting a red dwarf star that has lots of flares and lots of ultraviolet radiation, maybe that would give evolution more mutations to play with. But when you start looking at the kind of details of these things, it's almost as if, and there's been some good examples of this, and it might be generally true, but it's almost as if organisms have already fine-tuned their rate of mutation. You can repair them, but you don't want to repair them too much, because it would then cost too much investment of energy. So it's probably not the case that you're ever going to be short of mutations to use your raw material. There's so many kind of sources of radiation or chemicals in your environment, or even just your own sloppiness when it comes to copying your DNA or whatever molecule you're using for your information, that you'll probably never be short of mutations to work with. So maybe it's the rate that your environment changes that determines how quickly things evolve. But again, you probably don't want an environment that changes too quickly, because then you won't be able to keep up with it, and you'll be driven to extinction because the environment around you is kind of too chaotic and too dynamic. So I think I've said lots of things, not really answered your question at all. But these are the kinds of features and factors which are important for that kind of thing. And
yeah, well, two factors I was wondering about were type of sun, including those with increased solar flares, and the other is comets, frequency of large objects hitting the planet, causing massive extinctions. Actually, another thing I've just thought of is continental drift. If there are similar tectonic processes, because evolution can occur in isolation on the island continents, whereas it can't on continents. And there are actually a number of factors, but the question is whether you get enough of a concentration of them to really force a change in the rate of evolution.
There is a theory called intermediate disruption. I think it's an intermediate disruption theory. The idea being you don't want your environment to be completely static and stable forever, because then evolution would reach the optimum within a mathematical sense at least. But also you don't want your environment to be constantly being perturbed and disrupted and changed by lots of massive impacts, because you then just keep wiping things out and keep driving everything to extinction. So somewhere in between, there'd be a sweet spot, an intermediate level of disruption or perturbation, where your environment is a moving target, and therefore evolution is constantly trying to catch up, but it can move fast enough to not be driven to extinction completely.
What about the actual size of the Earth-like world? Say a sort of a super Earth as opposed to one more towards the size of Mars. So
yeah, so again, a lot of thought has been going into this, because when we start building these next generation telescopes that will start reading the chemistry of the atmospheres of these extrasolar planets we found, we want to know what a good criteria to select one to put to the top of the list to study first. So how big a planet do you want? Can a planet be too small, or can a planet be too big? And there's reasons that planets can be too small, and Mars is too small for several reasons. Because when you have a less massive planet, it has less stronger gravity and is less able to hold onto its atmosphere for long periods of time. If you're a smaller planet, you cool down more quickly because your volume to surface area ratio is different, which means you're likely to lose your magnetic field, which is generated in your convective core, which has happened for Mars. Once you lose your magnetic field, you lose that protective cocoon that stops the solar wind stripping you of your atmosphere by blowing it away. And you also lose volcanism, which is the process that keeps topping up your atmosphere with carbon dioxide. So you die quickly as a planet if you're too small. But we don't really know what the upper limit on being too big might be. And there's been a couple of modelling studies, which are, I mean, the problem is that all of this stuff is quite poorly constrained. We don't really know. We can drop models to make some kind of predictions, but we don't really have anything more than 1 or 2 data points to try to fit them to. And the idea is that if a planet starts getting too big, it starts having too much internal heat, and maybe things like plate tectonics become too active, or the crust is too thin and doesn't kind of reach an appropriate thickness. But again, we're basically just arm waving with a bit of maths to kind of back it up with the conclusions to get it past the peer reviewers. I'm a biologist, so I get to say these things.
There must be some more questions. Is there one here? There we go.
Yes. I was just wondering if you could take any variety of organisms on the planet now and populate the Earth with them from 4.5 billion years ago, how would things be different? I mean, imagine with the water, you need to have stuff underneath the water to get the oxygen for the ozone. But
if you had a time machine and I were to take you back to, let's say, 3.5 billion years ago, you would die very, very quickly because there'd be no oxygen back then. And then similarly, if you were to go back in time machine and pick up some of the earliest inhabitants of our planet and bring them forward to now, they would die just as quickly because the environment around them has changed in a very deep and fundamental way because of these cyanobacteria, because of the oxygen they polluted the atmosphere with and oxidized and rusted the entire surface of the planet. And you hinted also at the ozone shield, which is a consequence of oxygen in the atmosphere, which starts cutting out the amount of ultraviolet radiation from the sun that can reach the surface and acts as a kind of radiation shield. And a lot of thought has gone into what other UV shields might be appropriate for other exoplanets, or what other greenhouse gases might be appropriate for blanketing and keeping the surface of the planet warm enough to keep liquid water on the surface. So people, as far as possible, are trying to think out of the box that we're familiar with to see what other possibilities might be viable.
No, but just the more complex cellular structures and the archaea and stuff. I mean, they've evolved over the time as well. And those, if they went back,
could you speak up?
They would. Oh, I'm sorry. They would. There'd be quite a large leap forwards that wouldn't have to be evolved. It's the actual evolution of the mitochondria and stuff, the basics of the machinery that would be saved.
So what is the question?
Would it be able to accelerate life much more? Would you cut it down to 1 billion years? Rather, if the evolved structures from now could be applied.
I see what you mean, sorry. So the question then, if you didn't hear it, was if you could take kind of complex, sophisticated life from now and take it back to the early Earth and assume it could survive the environmental conditions of much more ultraviolet radiation and lack of oxygen and things, would that have been, could you accelerate evolution from that kind of a more advanced starting point? Because as you're hinting at, our kind of cell, the cell that makes up humans and all plants and amoeba and kind of eukaryotic life, is a much more sophisticated and complex kind of cell than bacteria. We've got a lot of internal organization and more complex control of our DNA and the kind of responses to the environment. And the reason we've got a lot of that internal sophistication, internal compartmentalization, is because we're essentially built up from bacteria we've taken inside ourselves, and they've become part of our structure, as it were. So provided that a eukaryotic cell could survive the environment, and eukaryotic cells, almost without exception, are aerobic. They need to have oxygen to be able to breathe. So the earliest you could take a eukaryotic cell back in your time machine would be when the oxygen level started picking up. And curiously, that's pretty much when we see eukaryotic cells arise on Earth anyway. So it's almost as if that kind of next jump in complexity was waiting for the environment to become acceptable for it, to enable that next step in evolution. But for a long, long period of time, we had eukaryotic cells floating around, but they didn't do the next step, which was multicellularity. They didn't stick together into colonies and then build things like animals. Stromatolites are made out of cyanobacteria, which were the earliest life forms that started pumping out oxygen in the first place. And some of the earliest forms of life on our planet are rock structures and layers that look quite a lot like stromatolites. So yeah, you could probably take back a stromatolite, and that would be happy in that environment because it would have been there in the first place.
At the beginning, you showed pictures of sci-fi aliens, people like the Vulcan from Star Trek, and you said they wouldn't look like that. But then you went on to say that the human body structure is pretty good, so they probably would look like that.
So
I mean, yeah, some of them might have 4 arms rather than 2 arms.
Exactly. It's how you define looks like and what features you're comparing.
Yeah, but their basic structure is a good one, so you would expect them to be something like that.
So you would expect certain features, such as some kind of orifice to put food into, to pie hole. You'd expect eyes, and you'd expect eyes to probably look a lot like our camera eye if it's an advanced, complex, intelligent alien. But beyond that, you probably wouldn't expect the overall appearance to be that similar to us. You certainly wouldn't expect a face like Leonard Nimoy here.
Why not? Why not?
What is it about that face that you would consider to be an inevitability?
Well, you want 2 eyes for binocular vision. You want the nose next to the mouth so you can recirculate the air to smell bad food. You want the ears close to the brain. It looks pretty good to me.
So in broad brushstrokes, but you perhaps wouldn't expect a nose to be looking like that.
I mean, depending on how much you've got to spend on makeup, you can deviate. But sort of, this is pretty much what we'd expect to see.
So the overall body plan and the kind of deeper things here are the number of limbs, which is something I did talk about, and how you might have 6 limbs rather than 4.
You might have 4 arms, which is a bit more expensive.
And looking at the hands, you would expect a Vulcan wave, perhaps with maybe 4 fingers rather than 5. But you need this.
If I see a 4-fingered man, I'd say, "Oh, that looks like a man to me."
I was just thinking of the types of stars, because a hot blue star is not going to last very long, but a red dwarf is going to last immeasurably longer than the sun. Also, the habitable zone around a red dwarf is going to be so close to the star that the planet is going to be tidally locked. So it's going to be one side of the fence is going to be facing the star all the time, the other side is going to be facing away. That's obviously going to have an effect on evolution as well.
Yes, these are all things that people are trying to think very hard about, because again, we want to be able to draw up sensible shortlists of which planets and which solar systems you want to follow up in with our next generation telescopes to start looking for biosignatures. Do we include red dwarfs on our list or not? They have a lot of plus points going for them because there's loads of them. They're very, very stable and long-lived stars, so evolution has a much longer opportunity to develop complexity and become a global ecosystem on the planet, compared to blue stars, which can be over in a couple of tens of millions of years, which would give you no time at all. On the other hand, the things you mentioned, there are quite big problems with red dwarfs. I've mentioned about their flariness. A certain subset of red dwarfs are quite flary, and that constant perturbation might be a stumbling block for evolution, certainly in complexity. And the tidal locking, again, is something we don't really know about. If you've got a thick enough atmosphere, maybe it doesn't matter that much that you've got one face constantly facing the sun, so eternal day and never-ending night on the other side, because the thick atmosphere would recirculate. It'd be very windy, but you'd be able to recirculate that heat, and the portion of your planet which has habitable conditions would be quite wide. So you might have kind of an annulus, a ring, around the terminator, on kind of the dawn and dusk part of the planet. But we don't really know. So there's a lot of unknowns in astrobiology, particularly when you start speculating about what an alien might look like. But the reason we're scratching heads and trying to work out some of these things is because it's going to get very important in the next 10, 20 years when we're looking for biosignatures on the planets and wanting to know which to put on top of our list for habitability.
Right. Oh, there's a question at the back there.
I don't know if it'll fall under the remit of this, but can you tell us a bit more about ExoMars then? So what and where will that launch from? Will that be launched?
So this is an ESA mission, so it'll be probably launched from French New Guinea, I think. Where is it, sorry?
French Guiana.
Yeah, that one.
It's probably going to be from Baikonur. We're probably
Oh, is it? Okay.
We're probably going on a Russian launch vehicle.
There we go. I don't deal with the fireworks that launch it. I deal with the instruments on the rover once they get there, as long as the delivery man can drop us off. So ExoMars is due for launch in 2018, as I said, and we're keeping off things that will actually go in 2018 this time and not get pushed back by another 2-3 years, which has become the pattern. There's been some problems with it because it was going to be a joint ESA and NASA mission. It was going to be a partnership. NASA then claimed it run out of pocket money, couldn't afford to do anything, and then it found a tenner in the back of its pocket and it's doing other similar Mars missions that doesn't include ESA, perhaps because they just want to have their say and control the mission, which you can understand if you're able to. So now ESA's got back into partnership with Russia, and we're hoping to kind of build a stable partnership for ExoMars on that. And there is still discussion and wrangling as to who gets to build what bit and who pays for what and how it's actually going to be put together. But I say my own direct involvement in it is in the Raman spectrometer, which is one of the instruments that can detect both minerals and organics. So it's a kind of a 2-for-1 instrument.
My sort of interest really relates to the underlying biochemistries that you might find in alien life. To what extent do you think that it's likely or otherwise to be similar to what we know, beginning with the fundamentals, if you like, of carbon and water, through to more complex things like the amino acids that we know, right the way through to the kind of information and processing that we have with RNA and DNA?
Yes, there's a whole, and I have an hour-long talk on that I've done as part of astrobiology courses at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. And the kind of discussion to be had is what degrees of alienness can you expect? And if you go down to the real fundamentals, would you expect alien life or extraterrestrial life to be water-based and carbon-based like us, or might they use alternatives? And it seems that if you're looking at the basic element of life, the extraterrestrial life would probably be carbon-based. It would probably be organic in the way that we are, simply because carbon is such a good atom for sticking together, sticking to itself and sticking to other atoms to build up a great deal of chemical complexity and building very complex large molecules such as DNA and proteins that can do a job, that can perform a function. So it seems that carbon is the only real runner, although people do speculate on silicon, which sits right beneath carbon in the periodic table and shares some features of its chemistry, although not many, and just seems a bit rubbish in comparison. When you start looking at the alternatives to the biosolvents for which we use water, things become a bit more interesting because you can use so water is a polar solvent, which makes it very good at dissolving lots of different kind of things, and things like ammonia might be able to perform a similar function. When you start looking at when you start looking at fluids like methane, which is very pertinent because there are seas full of the stuff, full of liquid methane on Titan, that would be a non-polar solvent. So it would operate in a very, very different way, and it would be at very, very low temperatures. And it seems like the showstopper might be you certainly can't dissolve things like DNA in liquid methane. So Titanic life would have to be very different to us. And you possibly can't dissolve any large molecules, or molecules of a particular size stop being soluble in methane. So maybe you can't use that as a biosolvent. But the idea around this is that I talked about the habitable zone, which is the kind of ring around a star where planets in that orbiting that ring would have the right surface conditions, so that water is neither freezing nor boiling, but it's kind of just right, it's liquid. But actually, when you think about it, if there are alternatives to water for your biosolvents, what you get is a series of rings all kind of nestled in each other and kind of partially overlapping with different solvents you can use, or perhaps not just talking about surface seas on a planet, but situations like Europa and Enceladus, which are far beyond the kind of classical habitable zone, but still to be seen to be jolly habitable in their subsurface, and have subsurface seas and oceans of liquid water. And if we start going beyond the absolute fundamentals to talk about what kind of molecules and building blocks that might be made out of, I mean, basically it's anyone's guess. We use a particular set of amino acids. We use about 22 amino acids in terrestrial biology. We start looking at carbonaceous chondrite meteorites, which are stuff packed full of organics, and they have something like 70 different kind of amino acids. So why do we use those 22 out of the 70 that we would probably have available? Have we picked the best set of 22? Have we picked a little bit of that kind of amino acid, a little bit of that kind, a little bit of that kind that have different chemical functions? Is it a random selection? Are there other sets which are equally optimal that we could have picked and therefore Martian life might have picked? Who knows? And that, I think, will be, if we find life on Mars and if we find stuff that hasn't been extinct for 3 billion years, but we've got cells that we can recover and kind of bring back to life, that I think will be about the most exciting discovery we could hope for. Because for the first time ever, it allows us to do comparative biology. It's not like comparative sociology and comparing different cultures or different nations and their kind of foreign policy or things you compare on Earth, but comparing biology as an entire construct and seeing if there's alternatives to DNA or alternatives to proteins, or how many different ways are there to skin a cat when you want to build life from scratch. But again, we don't really know yet. Yeah?
Yeah, I'm interested in the composition of a planet's atmosphere that would make it suitable for large animal life. I mean, our atmosphere comprises about a third oxygen and 2/3 nitrogen. Would you have to have something basically similar to that, or could you say have a third oxygen, 2/3 carbon dioxide? Could you have a much more oxygen-enriched environment? You know, what are the sort of parameters that you'd need to have?
In Earth's history, we have had times when the oxygen levels have been much higher. I think it was the Carboniferous when there was the kind of dragonflies, like kind of 2-meter wingspans, and it was because the oxygen levels were higher, and organisms like insects, which don't have such an efficient respiration system like our set of lungs, could still get enough oxygen to support kind of an active lifestyle and therefore grow very, very big. So you can certainly have an Earth-like planet with Earth-like life with a greater oxygen concentration on it. But if you start looking in the opposite direction and ask how much oxygen in your atmosphere is enough for supporting complex animal life and then therefore maybe intelligence, again, we don't really know. But as I said, this seems to have been the trigger that as the oxygen levels accumulate and built up in the atmosphere and in the oceans and the kind of sediments and things, that it almost kind of tripped over a minimum threshold, and we suddenly see eukaryotic life, and then later we see animal life and multicellular life developing from there. We don't know for certain, obviously, what it might have been waiting for, what the trigger might have been, but the oxygen levels were clearly very important. As I said, if I'd been given this talk 2 or 3 years ago, I would have been able to say, without a single exception, all animal life on Earth is aerobic. It needs to breathe oxygen at some point in its life cycle to survive. And we found some, as you always do, found some exceptions to the rule about 2 years ago in the anoxic, so the oxygen-free mud, the silt at the bottom of the Mediterranean. And there are animals down there which reproduce. They spend their entire life cycle without needing to breathe oxygen. They are one of very few examples of anaerobic animals, although they have probably readapted from what was originally an aerobic ancestor. So they probably, I don't think you can conclude from that you can ever get to animal life without having gone through an oxygen-rich atmosphere in the first place.
Yeah.
That's right. Come around this way. We've reappeared at this way. Any other questions? Oh, there is one, sorry.
All the way back in.
I should have got it from that.
Going back to, I don't think this is on actually. Going back to your spaceman, the bald guy with
Short,
no
fat,
legs.
bald, and ugly.
Just thinking about this mission to Mars, and they've had 78,000 applicants for this one-way mission to Mars, and your comment about what effect space would have on the human body. Sorry, it is a bit convoluted, but bear with me. I was thinking along the lines of when people moved higher up into the mountains in either South America or in the Himalayas, there was a certain group of people that found it very difficult to reproduce because of the change in atmosphere. The air was thinner. But over generations, they were able to...
Did they get out of breath during the process?
They worked it out, didn't they? So, based on that, when do you think people will be able to evolve to the point where space reproduction would be possible, and so long-term life in space would be possible?
Again, I don't know too much of the nitty-gritty details about this, and I don't know exactly, I don't think it's even known particularly well, where in the process from sperm meets ovum and fertilizes, and then you go through kind of the blastocyst stage and the kind of the fetus all the way up to an embryo and then a fetus which is ready to be born. I'm not entirely sure where in that multi-step process that the kind of stumbling block is that you need gravity for. And it's almost certainly in the kind of very primitive early stages when you've basically just got a bundle of cells that has to take a cue from something as to which becomes the top end and which becomes the bottom end. And things like the gravitational gradient will be important in that. So it might be that it's such a fundamental part of reproduction that you can't really mess with it. And it'd be very difficult to evolve naturally to reproduce in microgravity. But then maybe we'd use technological solutions. Or to be fair, a lot of this would becomes redundant if we start being able to produce artificial gravity in space. And that's easy because you just have a cylinder or part of a donut of your spaceship which you just spin. And then you use the centrifugal force to kind of walk around on the inside. So you can mitigate a lot of this issue by creating artificial gravity, although that is, in an engineering sense, pretty hard to pull off. So maybe you would do it in an easy way and let the astronaut's body adapt to their new environment and then them just consign themselves to never being able to go back to the Earth's surface again because they've adapted to the microgravity that they're in, and then it works for them.
Right, any more questions? In fact, you asked the very one I was going to ask, because if everyone's going to arrive there legless, how on earth are we going to colonise anything? The other question I was going to ask was the great idea was with Mars to actually plant masses of trees, build up the oxygen and the atmosphere again, but as you've said, with no magnetosphere, it'll all be wiped away anyhow.
Well, so, I mean, this is the whole idea of terraforming. And if it would take a while, it'd take hundreds of years and be very expensive to go through a multi-step process of pumping up the Martian atmosphere by basically kind of remelting the polar ice caps as well as carbon dioxide, dry ice, and kind of putting that carbon dioxide back into the air, having a sufficient atmospheric pressure on the surface to make liquid water stable, which means you can start using kind of greenhouses and domes to start trying to grow things like cyanobacteria and lichen, to then start converting the environment to something where kind of plants and trees might be able to survive outside and pump up the atmosphere to the state when humans can be there. And you could do that whole thing. It would take centuries and centuries and centuries to do. And it would still take millions of years for the sun to then re-strip away that atmosphere. So on a human timescale, even if there was no magnetic field to protect it, it probably wouldn't matter all that much in the short term, because we could do it more quickly than the sun would be able to strip it back away again.
Fascinating. Well, thank you very much. That's been a tremendous talk. Any more questions before we go? Yes, one more. We'll ask that one, and then I think we've got to get to the pub.
My question is, given the difficulties you've expressed in putting a human into space in a microgravity environment, and it can obviously be solved, as you said, two ways, by biological means, biotech, or it can be solved mechanically, i.e., rotating spheres for you to live in. If we're going to try and get a moon to Mars or further afield, would you suggest we're better off going mechanical or biotechnological, especially given that we're having quite an increase in our genetic ability to manipulate our own genomes And also, is it worth doing that if we end up just making a space race that's no longer sort of part of the human race?
So you're right that there might be a speciation event where people living in space would become so different from people still living on Earth's surface or Martians living on Mars' surface that there might be a period far in the future when we stop being able to reproduce with each other. And again, this is quite a common trope of sci-fi books and literature. And the idea that humanity might kind of fragment and then start having kind of massive civil wars with itself between different star systems and things. This is the idea. But actually you don't need to start mucking around with kind of gene therapy and things in order to mitigate a lot of these problems of space travel, because you can use drugs. You can use kind of biochemistry to try to trick the body into stop reducing its muscle mass or to start demineralizing its bones. And that the problem of bone demineralization in space is similar, although not perfectly, to things like osteoporosis. So there's kind of links from kind of terrestrial diseases and issues that people are trying to solve and space problems that people are trying to solve for long-term habitation. And I don't know when the first mission to Mars will be successful and when we have a good enough chance of pulling it off and not landing 3 corpses in the kind of landing capsule. But the solution will probably be a combination of engineering, and I don't know whether we'll bother with a spinning, rotating section for the first mission, but subsequent missions it seems like a good idea. So it'll probably be a combination of engineering solutions as well as biological and kind of drugs and things to keep the astronauts healthy. Kevin Fong is the man you want to be talking to for kind of more of that space medicine.
Trying to get him to come along here one day. Well, thank you very much. That's been tremendous, and we'd like to thank you in the normal way for all that you've done for us tonight.